So this talk is called Special Relativity, Moving the Goalposts, number 2, Ether. So I gave a talk for the Chapel Natural Philosophy Society dealing with some of the issues about ether, and it's my hat is associated with that group. So I was writing this talk about ether for moving the goalposts in special relativity, and part of that I used in the talk for the Chapel Natural Philosophy Society, but some of the things I missed out because I didn't think there would be time to cover it all. So what you got here with moving the goalpost is a more complicated example of moving the goalpost. Ether can be spelt two ways, with the A or without the A, and it's a concept of that for light, that being a wave, there should be a medium for those waves to move in called ether. The issue of ether in special relativity can be looked at in various different ways, and I have done so in several videos. So I'm just going to look at it now in another way. This is the paper by Einstein in 1905 where he first talks about special relativity. Now I have an issue with the usual translation of that paper into English. I think it was a pretty bad translation, but I'm going to put aside for now the issues of the paper being a bad translation. This is what Einstein says. He refers to experiments and then he says this sort of thing. Examples of this sort, this is Einstein saying it now, examples of this sort, together with the unsuccessful attempt to discover any motion of the Earth relatively to the light medium, suggest that the phenomena of electrodynamics as well as mechanics possess no properties corresponding to the idea of absolute rest. And he goes on to say a lot more, but if I give you a few minutes you can read that for yourself. So either pause or try reading it quickly. So moving on. So he gets rid of absolute rest, and by declaring ether as superfluous, that's often interpreted as discarding the ether, although there are people who would argue with that and say otherwise. They say superfluous does not mean discarding the ether. It seems to be the mainstream point of view in general to decide that superfluous means discard the ether. And then what Einstein does next is to bring in relativity principle and about light speed constancy. There are many good criticisms of special relativity, and I'm pointing at this one by a paper where it's entitled Einstein and Galileo's Principle of Relativity. And what the person says is the fundamental error in Einstein's second postulate is that he effectively reintroduced with his stationary system the ether model, most likely without noticing it, because he rejected the ether model himself in the same article. It is generally accepted that an absolute stationary system does not exist. As a result, only stationary system with respect to another system can exist. As a consequence, that other system is also stationary with respect to the first mentioned one. Therefore, the introduction of a stationary system is senseless, whether it is put in quotes or not. Einstein even defined it as the stationary system. So basically Einstein is talking about a stationary system, and that seems to be in conflict with his idea of discarding the ether, because stationary system is in one sense an ether system. By the relativity principle, there's supposedly no preferred ether frame, and such things get called such things as absolute frame and so forth. But Einstein seems to be bringing the concept back in when he talks about stationary system in his paper. The way that people try to get around that is to say Einstein was not aware properly about what he was talking about and didn't recognise that when talking about stationary frame, that was talking about a preferred ether frame in a different way. Thus, when discarding preferred ether frame, he was mistaken. Another way is more complicated of talking about it, and that's to interpret the principle of relativity as treat all inertial frames as equivalent, so can treat all inertial frames as stationary from their own perspective. So you get ambiguity from the words not being precise enough, making what's said as subjected interpretable in different ways, i.e. the theory becomes ambiguous. A person reading Einstein can suddenly want to interpret what's being said in different ways. So moving on from that, so the moving goalpost method allows special relativity to say one thing and say the opposite. The following book refers to C as the speed of light through the ether, and I'm quoting it, and it's called The Introduction to Modern Physics. It says the wave moving longitudinally toward mirror M2 has a velocity relative to the apparatus of c minus v on the outgoing trip, c the speed of light through the ether, and that's the relevant bit. It's saying that c is the speed of light through the ether. Other texts don't seem to talk about c as being light speed through the ether. So it's just this book in 1947, but from the original it's 1928. So in 1928 they were talking about light speed through the ether when they were talking about relativity. More modern relativity books seem to miss talking about it that way. So the moving goalpost method applied to special relativity allows any proper mention of ether to be erased. It allows the method of the book 1984, where a person can be made into an unperson by being written out of history. And this is the book. It's a book by George Orwell. It's called 1984, and it's the idea that Big Brother is watching you. You're living under a dictatorship where history keeps getting rewritten. So the moving goalpost method applied to special relativity allows any proper mention of ether to be erased. It follows the method of the book 1984, where a person can be made into an unperson by being written out of history. Ether can be made unether by not referring to c as light speed through the ether. So basically that book I quoted on relativity was talking about c as the light speed through the ether, and then later books on relativity don't want to talk about it in the same way. So that's suddenly ether is written out of history, out of the textbooks. As per Wikipedia, the book 1984 is a dystopian social science fiction novel and cautionary tale written by George Orwell. It was published in 1949. So it basically points out that those who fall out with a party, that's a political party, become an unpersons disappearing of all evidence of their existence destroyed. Similarly, ether becomes unether with proper evidence of its existence in the words being used being destroyed. So that's how they try to treat these things in physics textbooks. Your physics textbooks can talk about ether, but suddenly it gets wiped out when you want to talk about C as being the light speed through the ether. So it's all word games or word play. Theorists, in the sense of that type of physicist, play a lot of word games, and in politics there's a lot of word play, word games as well, where you try to change the meaning of words. So let's get to some maths in Einstein's 1905 special relativity paper. Einstein says this: let there be given a stationary rigid rod and let its length be L, and that L looks like a 1 in some sense, it's a lowercase L, as measured by a measuring rod which is also stationary. We now imagine the axis of the rod lying along the axis of X of the stationary system of coordinates, and that a uniform motion, a parallel translation of velocity along the axis of X in the direction of increasing X is then imparted to the rod. So I'll leave you a few minutes to read that, or else pause the video. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So quickly moving on, and now we also have all this being said. So I'll leave a few minutes for this, for you, well, a few seconds for you to read this. Pause or try to read very quickly. Okay, moving on. Hopefully you're a fast reader. So Einstein then goes on to say this as well: let it be reflected at B at the time TB, and that's light, and reach A again at the time T dash A. Taking into consideration the principle of the constancy of the velocity of light, we find those following equations. Give you a few seconds to read that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what Einstein is doing is he has the length of the rod as R subscript AB before the relative length contraction is taken into account, and then he is calling it the length L, where L is the lowercase L. So want to look at this equation in more detail. It is Newtonian physics before the relativistic effect taken into account. So how is it derived? Well, Newtonian physics comes in two forms. Newton is the light particle theory and Huygens is the light wave theory. Actually, Newton is more complicated than this. We're dealing with wave particle duality of light, but in the way it usually gets talked about, it gets simplified as just being a particle theory. So really wanted to deal with a particle of light versus a wave theory of light in a Newtonian physics context. So what we have is Newton's particle theory of light versus Huygens' wave theory of light, and Einstein doesn't go into sufficient details about this in his 1905 paper on special relativity, i.e. he doesn't talk about it at all. So the situation we have is that we either got a particle moving along or we've got a wave moving along, and they're moving between points A and B on a rod. In the wave situation, the wave would be travelling through a medium which is called ether, and that would be giving you an ether frame. And now I've dealt with this in my video for the Chappell Natural Philosophy Society, so if you want to go into that detail, you should go to look at that. But basically I'm looking at those equations in terms of whether it's a particle theory or whether it's a wave theory with an ether frame, and it looks to me that Einstein's math has an ether frame. So seemingly discarding the ether by what he's saying with the ether being superfluous, Einstein's math still seems to be having the ether frame in it, and that would make it the same as the Lorentz theory. In the Lorentz theory, that has an ether. So I'm going to give a reference now about what is said about Lorentz theory. I'm quoting, "It's important to note that while Lorentz theory is mathematically indistinguishable from special relativity theory," and special relativity theory is usually taken to be what Einstein's talking about in 1905, "the basis is different. Specifically, the former is not strictly speaking a relativity theory at all, as it does not reject the ether as a standard of rest by which velocities, distances and times can give an absolute meaning." So Lorentz theory has an ether frame, and the maths in Einstein's theory seems to have the ether frame as well. So Einstein's stating the relativity principle, but he doesn't seem to be obeying it. He seems to be introducing an ether frame, the same as what Lorentz theory has. So it's called relativity, but he's still got them. He's not absolutely obeying the idea of relativity, and he's going to violate that idea. For the Lorentz theory, it has the ether frame and it brings in the relativistic factor. So Einstein seems to be doing the same, but mistakenly saying the ether is superfluous. Thus we have this mess leading to the moving of the goalposts, where some will say there is no ether in special relativity and some will say there is ether. Mainstream just keeps trying to sweep certain things like this under the carpet. It's not going to want to address the issue of Einstein's maths on that issue of the ether has the ether in it. So you can end up with moving goalposts, with some people thinking the theory doesn't have an ether and some people thinking it does. And that's why it's a complicated goalpost moving, because not everybody's agreeing to the goalposts being moved. Some are wanting to move the goalpost one way and other people are wanting to move the goalpost in a different direction. So thank you, finish. Cheers.